Okay, it is start time. It is noon Eastern time. Welcome everybody to our webinar today on the Battle of the UI Libraries. We're going to talk a little bit about Blazor, React, and Angular. We'll talk about some of the things specific about Blazor, as well as take a look at doing some comparisons between Blazor, React, and Angular. So to get started here, let's do this. If you have any questions along the way, there's a questions dialog that you can put your questions into, or there should be a question box in the webinar software or the web page. If you could put your questions into that, and then I'll answer those questions at the end of the webinar during the question and answer session. Also, you can ask more questions during that time as well. You might see there's a little chat box too. Don't use the chat box for questions, just use the question box. That way I can see them all kind of line up nicely. All right, with that said, let's go ahead and dive here into our content. So our agenda is going to be a little bit of a welcome, tell you a little bit about WebAge and a little bit about myself. And then we're going to take a look at Blazor. We're going to do a little bit of coding, nothing significant. But we'll take a look at creating a couple of Blazor projects, show you some interesting things about those, and then we'll do our comparison here between Blazor, React, and Angular. And then finally, at the end, we'll take whatever questions you have, be more than happy to answer them for you. So a couple of things here about WebAge Solutions. I've been working with WebAge teaching classes since really the late fall of 2014. They are a fantastic training company to work with. They really have a desire to help employees and their employers really strengthen the skills that are necessary to really help those organizations achieve their goals. And also, as a student in the class, learning these newer skills also just kind of helps your career in general. There's really three core values that WebAge follows to really shape how they deliver their training. Number one, they want to be easy to work with. Right? So they don't want you to have to jump through a whole bunch of hoops to get a training class in place. They want to try to meet you where you are and make it very easy to work with them. Also, they want to go the extra mile. You know, so many people in today's world try to do the bare minimum to get something done, but that's not the case at WebAge. They like to go the extra mile, and they like to dot their I's and cross their T's to make sure that the customer is happy and that the training class is delivered successfully. And the last one is they take ownership. They really want to take ownership of these classes that they're delivering and not just look at just an individual type of class, but kind of take a look at how that class fits into the larger training scheme that you're trying to do within your organization. So why choose WebAge? They've been delivering solutions now for over 20 years. And if you think about all the different types of classes, all the different styles of teaching and learning, and you think about all the different instructors and all the different topic areas that they've delivered on over those 20 years, you know, to have a score, you know, right around 9 out of 10 is really amazing in terms of people's satisfaction and the learning that they've gained from all of those classes. Another thing that they try to do is not just send off a bunch of kind of canned course material to the customer, but instead work with the customer to customize the outline and customize the material to the specific topics and interests that their students have. Ultimately, they're very flexible on how the courses are delivered. They can be delivered in person, they can be delivered online, or they can be delivered in a blended format, whatever makes the most sense for the customer and their needs and where their students are all going to be taking the course from, so on and so forth. And of course, like I mentioned, the customization and the content tailoring to what the client needs. That's a big part of WebAge's business. So let's get started first with talking a little bit about what Blazor is. First, Blazor is a single page application framework for web apps. So when you think of things like React, Angular, Vue.js, all of those are single page application frameworks. The basic idea is you download a web page into your web browser, And then as the user is interacting with the web page, the actual web page never like reloads again from the server, kind of giving that very smooth desktop-like experience for users. It's similar to things like React and Angular because it's going to be component-based, but unlike things like React and Angular and Vue, is you do the majority of your coding in C#. So instead of writing all of your SPA stuff in JavaScript, you're going to be writing it all in C#. And it supports two hosting models, server as well as WebAssembly. So what I wanted to do is actually take you on a little bit of a tour of those two hosting models so you can kind of see what they look like and how they operate. We're not going to be doing a lot of custom programming here or anything like that, but I am going to fire up some new solutions and we'll take a look at kind of how they operate. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here and just open up Visual Studio. Okay, all right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over to, hold on one second, come over to here. I'm going to do a new project. Give it a second to load our project templates here. Okay, so what I'm going to do is here in Visual Studio, I'm going to search on Blazor. Give it a second to filter that. Okay, you'll see I've got my Blazor server and Blazor WebAssembly options. So whenever you talk to somebody about Blazor, maybe a potential client, maybe a project within your organization, or even if maybe you're a trainer joining this particular webinar and you're thinking about teaching Blazor classes to your customers, a very important question that you're going to have to always ask is it going to be Blazor server or Blazor WebAssembly? A lot of the components and stuff that you build are going to work in both with no issues. But ultimately, there are some differences in how these two different hosting models actually execute. Blazor server is going to run the code, run your C# code on the server and send UI updates via WebSockets. So the page doesn't reload in the browser, but the actual UI re-rendering and the updates are still server-based, being sent back and forth over WebSockets. Blazor WebAssembly is completely client-side. It's just like a React or an Angular application that gets fully downloaded to the web browser and executed on the browser. That's how Blazor WebAssembly works, except that instead of distributing a bunch of JavaScript files, instead you're going to be distributing some WebAssembly and a bunch of .NET DLLs, including your compiled application, and then all of that actually runs as WebAssembly inside of the web browser. A lot of folks, when they first hear about Blazor and they hear about the WebAssembly, that's kind of like their thing they want to do. They want to do the WebAssembly because it sounds super cool. It's using the latest and greatest browser technologies, and you don't have to maintain that WebSocket connection back to the server. But Blazor WebAssembly does present a couple of challenges for a lot of organizations. Say, for example, you have an organization that's still using some form of Windows authentication for their web apps. Unfortunately, Windows authentication is not going to work with Blazor WebAssembly. It doesn't work with Blazor WebAssembly for the same reasons Windows authentication doesn't work with React or Angular. There's no server-side part to the application. It's all client-side. However, you can use Windows authentication if you're doing a Blazor server app. So if you have an organization that wants to use Blazor, but they have to use Windows authentication, then your only option is Blazor server. Another thing that I've also seen is sometimes clients will have very restrictive outgoing firewalls. Those firewalls won't allow DLL files to be downloaded through them. Well, if that's the case, then you're going to have to go with Blazor server, because with Blazor WebAssembly, it does download DLLs into the web browser and runs them as part of the WebAssembly code. So in that instance, you'd have to go with Blazor server. Of course, the downside to Blazor server is you have that WebSocket connection. And so if you have an environment where you don't want to be dealing with WebSocket connections and stuff like that, then Blazor WebAssembly would be your better option. So there definitely are some factors to consider in terms of where the code is executing and which hosting model you choose to go with. With that being said, though, let's go ahead and create one of each of these projects and kind of explore a little bit about how they work. And then ultimately, we're going to compare it to React and Angular. So we'll do Blazor Server first. Out of the two hosting models, most of the classes that I sell are going to be the Blazor Server. For whatever reason, that seems to be the most popular at the moment. So let's go with Blazor Server. So we'll just go ahead and do, we'll say Blazor Server app, and we'll just create that. I'm going to pick .NET 6, configure for HTTPS. Because Blazor Server does run on the server, you can actually Dockerize it. So if you're into containerization and stuff like that, you can Dockerize or containerize a Blazor Server application. So we'll go ahead and click Create here. Give it a second to create. Okay, cool. So if we come over to here, you'll see we have a folder here with a bunch of pages. Let's just grab the index page here. So this would be like the home page that you would load up. What I want to show you here is that you're basically coding with Razor syntax, but with components, with element-based components, right? So you'll see up here at the top, we've got a kind of a Razor directive doing some routing configuration, saying this is the home page. But then you'll notice we have these, what look to be custom elements. They're really just calling other, what are called Razor components. So this will set the page title. This is going to display a survey. If we open up counter.razor over here, you can see it's the counter page, but then the rest of this is like regular web page stuff. And then you'll notice down here, we have a code block, which is what's going to have all of our event handlers and variables and stuff like that we might want to be rendering in our page. So to run this thing, I'm going to click the little green play button here. And this should fire up for us in Edge. Okay, now what I'd like to do here is I'm going to open up our developer tools, and I'm going to come over to the network tab. Okay, cool. I'm going to click on the WebSocket filter. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to refresh this page, and we're going to see some WebSocket connections pop up. We're going to find the WebSocket connection that's actually doing the UI stuff back and forth. And then we're going to take a look at the traffic going back and forth as we interact with the page. So what I'll do is reload this. It should pick up our WebSocket connection, which you see here. Okay, so we've got several different connections here being used. So these are the messages for those WebSocket connections. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on counter. Remember, we saw the counter thing. It's going to take us to the counter page, which is just going to replace this content that we have here with the little counter button. So if I click on counter, you see this here. Now let's see if we can find our data being sent back and forth here. So if I do click me, maybe I got the wrong one. There we go. That's what I'm looking for. So I want you to watch this here. It's kind of hard to see. Okay, so if you look at this, the last time is 12:14 and 28 seconds, 33 seconds. Okay, now I'm going to come over here and click on click me and watch what happens. See how new entries are being added each time I do click me? You'll see the value for current count is increasing, but the page is not reloading. And you see all of this WebSocket traffic over here. The reason for the WebSocket traffic is because the actual increment is being done in C# code on the server. So you see why we call this a single page framework. A single page framework doesn't necessarily mean there's no server part. I mean, after all, most single page apps have to call the server for REST APIs and stuff like that. But in this particular situation, we're, instead of calling, let's say, like a REST API, we're calling some code that's actually updating the UI. But instead of doing it over HTTP and triggering a refresh, it's all happening over WebSockets. Blazor server is probably a little more comfortable for people who are coming, let's say, from a web forms or ASP.NET MVC background. It makes it a lot easier to actually integrate with a database. You don't have to have a separate REST API and things like that, because your code is ultimately running on the server. The downside, though, is you do have to keep this WebSocket connection. And so all of the little difficulties you might run into when having a web application using WebSockets, depending upon how many servers you have, how you're load balancing, other firewall types of issues. Also, each WebSocket connection does take up a little bit of memory and other resources on your web server. Nevertheless, it does give you that really nice UI experience that we get from modern SPA apps, and you don't have to learn JavaScript to make this happen. You can continue leveraging your existing C# knowledge. In fact, one of the things that I'm going to mention to you is that the primary reason that people use something like a Blazor and using C# is to avoid JavaScript. So if you're trying to avoid JavaScript but want a SPA-like experience for your users, Blazor can be a really, really good choice. Okay, so that's the Blazor server using the WebSockets to get your UI updates. Let's take a look at the other hosting model, Blazor WebAssembly. So I'm going to close that tab, come back over to our Visual Studio here. So we'll go ahead and create a new project. For this one, we're going to do Blazor WebAssembly. Click Next, and then we'll click Next. So actually, let's give it the name. We'll say Blazor WASM. Click Next. Now you'll see here our options are a little bit different. Number one, there is no Docker option. There's no Docker option because this is not running on the server at all. When we compile and build this application, the result is just a collection of static files, like you'd have from a React application or have from an Angular application. That's all it is. When we go to run this, it is going to kind of stand up a little test web server, because you do have to have a web server to deliver the static files, but we're not actually going to be hosting it on an actual server-side app. Now, you do have the option of doing an ASP.NET Core hosted, but don't get confused by that. That doesn't mean running the WebAssembly on the server. What that means is most SPA applications need a REST API of some sort. So what Visual Studio is willing to do for you here is create this WebAssembly app that runs completely client-side, but serve it up from some type of server-side ASP.NET Core REST API that can then provide data through AJAX calls to that WebAssembly app. But to kind of keep things super focused in on Blazor here, I'm not going to check this box. You can also do a progressive web application. So a progressive web application doesn't work with Blazor server because there's no way to run the application in offline mode. You have to have the server to do the rendering, period. But with Blazor WebAssembly, because the whole thing really is running client side, you can have a progressive web app, so you can enable that if you want to. But we're not going to check any of those. We'll just keep this one checked here. Also, for authentication type, I didn't show you this for the other one, but you'll notice there's no Windows authentication. In the Blazor server, if you were to select authentication type, you'd see Windows authentication listed, but there's no Windows authentication here. And that's actually really, really important, by the way. One of the first Blazor classes I ever taught was a Blazor WebAssembly class. And we got into the class, everything was going awesome. The class ended awesome, it was great. About a week later, I got an email from one of the students saying, hey, I can't make this thing work with the authentication that we're doing. And that student really just did not understand why Blazor WebAssembly was not going to work with Windows authentication. Even though they understood it was running in the browser, they thought that because it was C# code, it should somehow be able to automatically still work with Windows authentication. And what that revealed was they really didn't understand how Windows authentication was even working on the server. It just did, and that's what they had always used. But keep in mind, when you're running in the browser, that is a totally different environment than what you have on the server in terms of things like Windows authentication. And you'll see here, there is no option for it, okay? So I'm gonna go ahead and click Create here. And in fact, now every time I teach a Blazor class, we have the conversation at the start of, what's the environment you're running in, and then we can pick the right hosting model. Okay, so here's our Blazor WebAssembly. If we come into here, you'll notice under Pages, we have basically the same pages as before. In fact, this is exactly the same. So just because I choose server over WebAssembly doesn't necessarily mean that everything's completely different. That's not true. A lot of the components you build will work equally fine on both, okay? So let's go ahead and run this, and let's take a look at what the network situation is going to look like here. Okay, I do not want to sync my profile. All right, let that load. Okay. All right, so let's take a look at this. I'm going to come over to here. I'm going to open up our developer tools again. Let's zoom in here, bring up network. Okay. First, I'm going to show you the cool part, and then I'm going to show you the not so cool part, okay? So here's the cool part. In our networking here, I'm going to make sure I select the all filter so we're getting all the traffic. And I'd like you to notice something here. I'm going to click on these different links, and you will notice something interesting here. There is no traffic going back and forth. Click on counter, click on click me. There is no network traffic, period. This is updating the UI with C# code, and there's no network traffic, which means what? The C# code is running in the web browser. Now, by a quick show of hands, who thinks that's pretty cool? You could raise your hand if you think that's kind of cool. I mean, we all get WebSockets and stuff like that, but who thinks that's pretty neat that I'm running C# code literally in the browser? Okay, that's like the big cool thing about Blazor, is that it's Blazor WebAssembly. It really is running C# code. And by the way, Blazor WebAssembly may be the first big platform to really do this in an enterprise production ready kind of way. But there's lots of other things coming out that can do this kind of stuff too. Some things in Python, in Golang, maybe even Java. So this is not just going to be a C# only thing in the long term. There's going to be any language that you could probably think of on the server side now. If you wanted to do client-side SPA application development with it, you can do that through leveraging WebAssembly. So it's super cool we can do it with C#, but if you like other languages too, those opportunities are going to be coming out as well. Not from Microsoft, but from other programming language communities. Now, let's talk about the downside. Everybody saw how long it took to load initially, right? That wasn't just my computer. It actually takes a few moments to download and run it. Why? It has to download .NET. It's using a scaled down version of .NET, but it actually has to download the WebAssembly, the .NET framework, and your application for it all to run. So you could start to imagine this might not be the best choice if you were trying to build an e-commerce site and needed that first page to load quickly. Now, it could work great in an environment like an intranet or something like that within your corporate structure, but for building, an e-commerce site, that initial page load counts for a lot. In fact, it counts for so much that a lot of folks don't even rely upon JavaScript to do that. They just do an actual server-side page render. So anyways, let's take a look here at what was actually being downloaded. Now, to make this work, I'm gonna have to do a couple of things. Number one, I need to disable my cache. Number two, I need to come into my history, and we're going to, let's see here. I need to clear browsing data, and we're going to clear for all time, if this will let me select all time. All right, let's try that again. All time, and I'm going to select everything. The reason I've got to come in here and delete everything is that it does a really great job caching. And so what'll happen is it'll all be cached, and you reload again, and it only downloads a few things, and you think, oh, well, it's not that much stuff. But if you clear everything out, then it goes and re-downloads everything again. So we'll do clear now. Give it a second to clean all that out. Okay, now we're going to come back over to counter. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to refresh the web page. See all this? Take a look at that. Told you, it downloads .NET. All right. Now that I've shown you that it downloads .NET, and let's click on our debugger there, hold on. Now that I've shown you that it downloads .NET, how many of you all, by a show of hands, are kind of sad? Because you're thinking, this is going to be a lot of stuff to download and impact that initial page load performance. Anybody by a show of hands? Yeah, see, I showed you the cool part first, but then I had to show you this part. So the thing is this, WebAssembly, I do think over time is going to replace a lot of the JavaScript coding that we do. And I don't mean just Blazor WebAssembly, I mean WebAssembly in general. But the thing to keep in mind is this. If you want to run something in the browser, you have to download it to the browser first. With JavaScript, you already have the runtime in the browser, so it doesn't have to be downloaded. You just have to download the code. But if you want to use any of these other programming languages, you're going to have to download their runtimes, their WebAssembly, as well as your application into the browser for it to run. Now, maybe at some point, common languages like a C# or a Java or a Python might be automatically included in a web browser installation, just like we have JavaScript, and that would definitely help this a lot. But ultimately, if you want to run it in the browser, the first has to be delivered to the browser. So if you take a look at this, it actually sent over 9.8 megabytes for basically an application that does nothing. You could just imagine a real app with a bunch of your application code. It's going to get a lot bigger. Now, the cool thing is if you apply the various optimizations that they give you, you can get this download to about 2 megabytes. So this is all unoptimized at the moment, but there are ways of making a production release that optimizes stuff, so on and so forth. Now, because of the caching that it does, if I come into here now, and let me, hold on one second. Let's see if I can. Is it still hitting that breakpoint? No, okay, good. Let's see if I can come up to here, and I'm going to reload this again now. So now, let me hit the little, I'm not sure why it pauses in the debugger when you have this open. It's kind of weird. It's been happening for a few months now. Anyways, you can see 1 megabyte transferred. So because of all the caching that it does, we were able to eliminate a lot of the stuff that was downloaded because of the caching. Nevertheless, as cool as WebAssembly is, a lot of times people go with the server either because of the security stuff I mentioned before, or just because the initial page load is so much faster. And the WebSockets isn't always that big of a deal for a lot of the applications where people would be doing Blazor development. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is come back over to here, and let's talk about. Well, actually, let's do this first. Let's finish up the why Blazor. So you're building spa apps with C# instead of JavaScript. Blazor is going to give you that whole component-based UI thing that things like MVC and web forms doesn't have, not really. So the big thing in the JavaScript world with React or Angular is the use of components, and Blazor allows you to do that. And as we were just talking about, if you're into WebAssembly, the WebAssembly hosting model leverages that. Although you're not really doing any real WebAssembly programming, that's already done for you as part of the Blazor framework. Okay, so why not Blazor? So one of the conversations I have at the beginning of any Blazor class that I teach is we just have an honest conversation about should you or should you not use Blazor? You know, what's the real motivation behind using it? First of all, if you're looking for raw performance in terms of UI updates, not putting too much burden on the network, initial download of the files, so on and so forth, React and Angular and the other JavaScript SPA stuff or libraries, they're going to give you better overall performance. So when we talk about Blazor, we're not advocating Blazor at the moment to say, hey, this is so much faster and better than React and Angular. The truth is it's not, okay? Also, if you like JavaScript or TypeScript, right? So if you're a JavaScript developer or a TypeScript developer and you love using those languages, then Blazor is not the right choice for you. You are better off doing React or Angular. Also, I have found when I need to do really complex things, it's easier to do it with the JavaScript frameworks than it is to do it with Blazor. While I'm not going to talk about it as part of this webinar, the interfaces that Blazor provides for running JavaScript code and being able to send data from Blazor into JavaScript or receive data from JavaScript into Blazor, they're really cool, but they're really awkward to work with. So Microsoft, when creating Blazor, really did a great job in trying to allow you to do some of the more complicated things in JavaScript or use third-party libraries from JavaScript and tie it into Blazor. But it has a lot of frustrations with it. It kind of reminds me back in the day. How many people here, by a show of hands, remember building server-side web apps where you always had to make the decision of, do I implement the code server-side or I do it in JavaScript? So you had these like hybrid JavaScript server-side apps, MVC, web forms, all of those kind of fell into that category. Raise your hand if you remember those. Yeah. One nice thing about SPA stuff is you get out of that world. Well, with Blazor, you kind of jump back into it because there are some things you're just not going to be able to do with C# and Blazor. You're going to have to use that third-party JavaScript library. Well, now you've got to deal with the integration part of it, okay? And that can be a little bit more challenging. So we're already starting the demo there. So the question then boils down to is, why would you choose Blazor? Ultimately, every class that I teach, the reason the students have chosen Blazor is because they don't like JavaScript. They either don't know JavaScript, they don't like coding in it, they want to code in C#. And that is probably the #1 selling point, is our team knows C#, they don't know JavaScript, we're comfortable with the Microsoft, web stack, we want to keep coding in C#, let's go with Blazor. That is the #1 reason. If you're an expert at JavaScript or TypeScript, I would still stick with those other frameworks and libraries over in those languages. Well, anyways, what I want to do now is a little bit of a comparison. What I did was created 3 very simple applications in Blazor, Server, React, and Angular. And we're just going to take a quick look at what's similar and different between them, just so you kind of get an idea of where things are similar if you're coming from Angular over to Blazor, or where they might be different, so on and so forth. So let me do this. Bring that. So let's start off first with React. And I'm going to open this up in VS Code. I'm also going to come over here and I'm going to open up the sample Blazor application so we can hop between them. Well, actually, let me stop this first. And let's grab the Blazor app. Okay, close this and this and this. Okay, so let's take a look here at a component called color list. So I have a component here called color list. This is in Blazor. If you're familiar with Razor syntax, you should be familiar with what we have on the screen. I've got a list of colors. I'm going to iterate over it. I'm going to output some information about the color, and I have a button here to be able to delete the color. You'll see here I have the ability to have parameters configured for my components. In React, we would call them props. In Angular, you would call them inputs. But I can have parameters here where I can pass in data, but I can also do like event callbacks and stuff like that. I can even output data from those event callbacks. If we were to come over here to React and go under components, we've got a component here called item action list. If you take a look, we're going to iterate over an array of items. So just like over here, let me see if I can do this. Oh, hold on. Okay. And we'll collapse that down and collapse that down. Okay. So if you take a look here, I'm using the for each syntax to iterate over my list of colors. Over here, I'm using the map syntax to iterate over my items. So it's the same basic idea. You just have some data, you iterate over it, and you generate a bunch of list items. Here in my list items, you can see I have a little function that'll generate the content. That's similar to what we have here. And then I've got a button here that I can click on, and it'll allow me to delete. If you were coming from React over to Blazor and working with these Razor components, this would be a very easy transition to make. In fact, back in 2018, when I first started working with Blazor, back when it was still in like pre-alpha or something like that, I took a React application that I'd built and I spent the morning converting it over to Blazor. And I literally, it was really simple to convert. I just looked at my React components, adjusted the syntax for Blazor, and before I knew it, I had a very simple, Blazor application up and running based on React. Anyways, you can see here we're setting up our button, and then down here you'll see there's not really any code. I mean, we've got prop types and default props and stuff, but it's really just this piece here. Well, up here, most of our stuff here is in the, we'll call the template part of our component. But then down here, I've got my parameters defined. Because this is done in JavaScript, I don't have to really do very much in terms of declaring props and stuff in terms of their types, because JavaScript is dynamic and loosely typed, whereas C# is static and strongly typed. You have to do more typing stuff on the C# side. For my event handler here, I have a function that I pass in here called action that I'm invoking. And this is similar. I'm just simply calling delete color and then invoking that and outputting my color ID. All right, let's take a look at what Angular would look like for the same thing. And we'll drag this over to the side. Let's close that. And let's go to color list. Okay. Now, with Angular, we have a little bit of kind of an additional complexity here. With Angular, we have really generally at a minimum 3 files with a component, 4 files if you include the unit test. It's possible to combine all those files together as like one file, but if you're using a tool like the Angular CLI, it's going to give you a new component with 3 files. So the problem is in Angular, it always feels like you're being overwhelmed with files. By a show of hands, anybody here an Angular developer, you ever feel overwhelmed by all the files that it creates as you create the different parts and pieces of your Angular app? Anybody Angular person? No? Well, if you did Angular development, it's easy to start to feel claustrophobic with all the files that are always being created anytime you create something new in Angular. So here, with Angular, we have not only a TypeScript file, but I also have an HTML file. Close some of these. I have an HTML file as well that has my template on it. Now here with Angular, the way we're going to do the iteration is through something called a directive that's applied here to the element. And then behind the scenes, there's code that Angular will run to do the iteration to generate the list items. You'll see here in React, or over here in React, and over here in Blazor, we have more traditional programming logic being used. But when you get into Angular, that programming logic is kind of being hidden from you by these built-in Angular directives. So a lot of times folks would gravitate towards Angular because it feels like they're doing a little bit less coding, especially in the older Angular JS. But really what they're doing is just hiding that iteration logic from you behind this ng4 directive. And then as you can see here, we have the color name and then our button here for doing the delete operation. Now with Angular, though, it's not enough to see the template. We're going to have to also come over to the actual TS file to see the logic. So you'll see with Angular, because Angular is coded with TypeScript, we have static and strong typing. And what you'll notice here is we have something very similar. So input, and then we have our output. And then in the case of doing our output here, we're just triggering that output directly from the button. You can also do something similar here. You can get rid of delete color and simply trigger the event callback directly from the button if you want to. So what you'll notice here is that we have things that are, some of it's similar and some of it's different. You'll see in the case of working with components in Blazor, you use more of that kind of a fake custom element that gets replaced with whatever the component is that you're calling. You'll also see more coding logic in the template, whereas Angular tends to use custom HTML elements that are not removed, as well as doing things like having these directives that hide some of that things like iteration or other selective type logic. But where Blazor is similar to Angular is when you start looking at how these parameters and stuff are being defined and all of the static typing and stuff that we do over in TypeScript when doing our Angular programming. Now, here's what's kind of interesting too. React is really just a UI library. It really just focuses in on giving you components to work with. Both Blazor and Angular are more of a framework. They include components, but they also include more. For example, one of the things that Angular supports are services and something called dependency injection. Raise your hand if you've ever used dependency injection before in C# Angular, anything. It's a very common pattern used in object-oriented development. Well, Angular supports out of the box dependency injection. So here I have a colors data service, which is being used to manage my colors, my list of colors in memory. Well, if I go down to my component here again, and I go to color home, TS, you can see that I am injecting that color data service into my component. And then down here, I call the colors data service when doing my various data operations. React doesn't provide any kind of support for that. React doesn't even attempt to solve the problem of how would I organize a bunch of, just kind of general functionality in the application. Angular, however, does provide a solution for that. It also provides things like modules and stuff like that as part of it as well. Routing, so on and so forth. Well, guess what? Blazor provides all that too. Blazor being built on the foundation of ASP.NET Core. If you go into Blazor here and we go into our Tools app web program CS, you can see that we are registering a colors data service. And this colors data service can then be injected into a component. So for example, if I go over to the color tool component here, you'll see at the top, I'm injecting my colors data service, just like I'm doing in Angular. There is no mechanism built into React for doing that. Now, if you like dependency injection, you think it's a good pattern, well, you're going to get that out of the box with working with Blazor or working with Angular. With React, you'd have to include some other third-party library that might provide that dependency injection for you. So you can really see here, Blazor is a framework as opposed to React, which is just a library. And then, of course, Angular is a framework as well. Also, for those of you who are C# people, you'll see that my project structure here is a solution with many projects. So just like in most .NET projects, you have a solution that has like a data project and a models project and a web project and some other things. I had the same type of setup here. So because of just how we do .NET development, I have an entire system for building a larger application, dividing it up into smaller pieces, so on and so forth. Angular also has something similar to that. So with Angular, you have the entire concept of working with modules. So there's a color tool module, a shared module, and you can organize your code into these modules, and then they all get imported into the parent app module. So Angular also provides a full module system as well for organizing your stuff, just like we're doing in Blazor. And in fact, you can set up in Angular something called an Angular workspace or an Angular library, and even take that to the next level in terms of further breaking your application apart. React doesn't really provide any of that because it's just focused in on providing you components. You have to come up with your own solution to manage those other things. So, looking at this from the battle of the UI's perspective, I know we talked a whole lot in detail about Blazor itself. That's kind of the new one. A lot of folks are already familiar with React and Angular. When would I choose, one over the other, right? How would I make that decision? So first of all, if I have a team of C# .NET developers and they don't know JavaScript or TypeScript and they want to stay in that C# environment, Blazor is going to be the first choice every single time. If I have a group of developers who are JavaScript or TypeScript programmers, experts, a lot of experience with it, I'm going to go with React or Angular. What I'm probably not going to go with is I'm probably not going to go with a server-side solution like an MVC or a web forms that does page reloads. I'm not going to do that. I like the SPA approach and the SPA experience. but really my choice of one over the other is going to be dependent upon where my developers are most comfortable. Now, if developer knowledge isn't a primary factor and we're looking at things like performance, like for example, getting that first page to load, then no matter which solution I pick, I'm going to find a way to do some type of server-side rendering on that initial page. Now, the cool thing is there are libraries out there that will let you do a server-side render for React or Angular on that initial page load. Also, you can do the same thing in Blazor Server, and I want to say pre-rendering is also an option now in Blazor WebAssembly. So it is possible through extra configuration to pre-render that initial page. So if you were looking for that, then potentially any of these options might work for you. Now, if you've got your C# developers and they're looking to use Blazor and then you have to choose WebAssembly or Server, I probably would go with Server just as my default, especially if we needed Windows authentication, firewall issues, or whatever for sending down DLLs. If I had a situation where I knew all of my users had a high-speed connection and that those DLLs are going to download really fast and we want them to be able to run in like an offline kind of mode, then I would gravitate more towards Blazor WebAssembly. But if I'm just building a standard intranet type, business type application, which by the way is really what a lot of .NET web developers really do, right? At least all the stuff that I've done with .NET over the years, most of them were some type of business application, either used internally or used by a few customers outside the business. I typically, I haven't seen a lot of .NET sites being built for, something on the scale of, let's say, Facebook. Most of the .NET stuff is a lot of it's financial, government, military, stuff like that, where these .NET apps are being built, and a lot of them are running over very fast networks, so on and so forth. And in that situation, if I wanted to make it a progressive web app, then I probably would go with something like a Blazor WebAssembly. But you would just have to be careful because that initial download is going to be slow. Now, after that, it runs really well, but that initial download would be slow. So you'd have to factor that into your decision-making process. But I'll tell you all three of them. So I teach a lot of React, I teach a lot of Angular, and I teach a lot of Blazor. And all three of them can definitely be used to build enterprise class applications and get really great results for your end users. And depending upon one's development preferences and their prior development experience, all three are really great to code with in terms of building applications, and of course working with a component-based UI architecture pattern. The last thing I'll say is this. Let's say you choose React and you get into the React project and React is not for you. All of that stuff that you learned about working with React components is equally applicable on a conceptual level to Angular and to Blazor. You get into Angular, Angular's not for you. All the stuff that you learned about components, even the stuff you learned about services, applies equally to Blazor. You get into Blazor and Blazor's not for you and you decide to jump over to React or Angular, you can take that knowledge you learned about components and apply it over there as well. Probably the biggest thing I would say is the big universal idea in modern UI development is this idea of working with components. And I'm here to say, working with components from a conceptual standpoint, best practices, best patterns are really the same no matter which one you pick. And so anyways, there you go. So there's three different options you have from this webinar in building SPA applications. But as we know, there's lots of additional JavaScript frameworks and libraries out there that also work really, really well. And like I said, keep your eye out for future WebAssembly stuff coming out in other languages. You're going to see things like Blazor pop up for other languages as well over time. All right, so if you would like to download the code for this, here is the URL to the Git repo. In fact, let me do this real quick. Git oat-v, and I will copy this over here into the chat. I think everyone can receive the chat message. So I'll just give you the link there in the chat. You're welcome to go download the code for this. And for the React and Angular app, just do npm install with Node.js and you can run it. For the Blazor app, just open it up inside Visual Studio and run it, and you'll be able to run it. And you can go in and kind of take a look. And I've tried to make it like an apples to apples comparison between the different libraries and frameworks. Okay, so with that said, let's go ahead and open it up to questions. I don't see any questions listed in the question box. If anybody has a question, go ahead and ask me. More than happy to answer. I'm happy to go a little longer than an hour or two, so there's no real time limit here. If you've got a question, and it can be on anything. It could be what we talked about on the webinar. It could be on any topic that you'd like. Any questions? All right, give you another minute here. People might be typing them out. All right, so I've got a question here. So which is more popular, Blazor Server or Blazor WebAssembly? Initially, Blazor WebAssembly was, because everybody wanted to do the WebAssembly stuff because it was new and it was cool. But as I started to talk to customers and kind of better qualify what their real needs were, in the end, ended up selling more Blazor Server classes. Even the Blazor WebAssembly classes that I occasionally teach, a lot of times the students will reach out to me months later and say, well, we really wanted to do Blazor WebAssembly, but ultimately we had to switch over to Blazor Server, and then they'll share with me whatever the reasons are. So while I think the WebAssembly stuff is cool, and I think it's going to be great for the long term, right now people are still kind of preferring the server with the WebSockets, right? But regardless of which hosting model you pick, how you write those components is mostly the same. The only real difference that I have noticed, other than just the execution model, is that some of the JavaScript stuff can be a little bit trickier to write for Blazor Server. You think about it, you're calling JavaScript code from C# that's being executed on the server. So if you kind of think about what you'd have to do to have the JavaScript code run on the client and communicate back to the server and then continue processing the server stuff, it's a little bit complicated. But in terms of which is more popular at the moment, I would say server. All right, we got another question here. What about React versus Angular? Which do I prefer? So I teach a lot of both. I've used a lot of both in projects that I've done for customers and projects that I do internally. I would say, if you had to ask me, I would probably say I like React better, but I don't dislike Angular. I think Angular is really good, and I have a lot of customers that use it, and I teach a lot of it. And I do have some internal projects that I chose Angular for. I think sometimes people will say, well, it kind of depends upon the project. I really haven't found a project where Angular versus React mattered, like they both could solve the problem fine. I think a lot of times people just say that because they don't want to offend one group over the other. So they'll just say, oh, well, it depends. Well, I've never really figured out what it depended upon other than just, people's programming preference. If you don't know TypeScript, then doing JavaScript and React is probably going to be a little easier. If you prefer TypeScript, then doing Angular with TypeScript is probably going to be a little bit easier. But both of them really honestly work equally well for building probably 99% of SPA applications out there. In terms of one being better than the other, I think mostly it's just people's preference. I don't keep up with all the benchmarks and stuff, but for a while, React was faster at rendering, and then Angular was faster at rendering, and I think React might be faster again. I'm not sure, but there's an intense competition there to see who can be the fastest rendering library. But both of them perform really well. And I will also say, when it comes to things like React or Angular, and probably even Blazor too, when you have real performance issues, it's usually because the developer made a bad choice in coding, It's not necessarily because of the framework, especially things like React and Angular are so battle hardened at this point. They perform really, really well. On the Blazor side, of course, it's newer, but Microsoft's been working really, really hard over the last several years to really improve performance and things like that, and getting those downloads smaller. And it's a really nice framework for building things. All right, any other questions from anybody? Okay. All right. Sure, no problem. Yeah, no, thank you very much. I was glad to be able to share this with you. Teaching these UI frameworks is one of the things that I enjoy teaching the most. I teach a lot of stuff, teach a lot of like Azure DevOps, teach a lot of Python. I know Python, I think it's called Pyodide. Don't hold me to that, is a WebAssembly framework that's coming to the browser on the Python side. But I teach a lot of Python for doing like automating tasks to doing pandas and NumPy and stuff like that. And Python's gotten really, really popular. In fact, if you had to ask me, if you had to say, what are the 3 top languages I should learn? I would say JavaScript, C#, and Python. Now, of course, if you're a Java person, you can do Java, Python, and JavaScript. And as part of JavaScript, I also include TypeScript. But those 3 languages, if you learn them, you could jump back and forth between any of these frameworks and libraries for building UI stuff. And so it makes it a lot of fun. Okay, any other questions from anybody? All right, very good. Well, thank you all so much for attending today's webinar. If you're interested in getting started on some training for React or Angular or Blazor, or any of the other technologies related to those libraries and frameworks, don't hesitate to reach out to WebAge Solutions. They would love to be able to work with you and your team to put together the class that you need to help your organization be successful. You can reach them by emailing getinfo@webagesolutions.com, or simply just go to webagesolutions.com and you'll find their contact information there. And I want to thank you all again for taking the time to be here. I wish you all the best with your future UI programming projects, and hopefully you'll get a chance to try out all 3 of these frameworks in the projects that you work on in the future.